Hey everybody, it's Sean Gibbons. Hope you're doing well on this, at least in Washington, sweltering hot summer day. Thanks for being with us. If you are online, my hope is that you've landed in the right place for today's webinar, which, as you can see from the screen, is called Engage, Persuade, Motivate, Maximizing Impact with Digital Content, something that I suspect many of you are doing on a daily basis. We're going to be joined in just a moment or two by my good friends Matt Schwartz and Sonongo Akem from the social good design firm Constructive. They do really tremendous work. In fact, if you've been a long-time network member, chances are you've seen a recent issue of Change Agent that they produced with us. It's really, really gorgeous stuff there. But today we're going to talk about digital content, and that's important because, as some of you may have heard us repeat from time to time, we are all, and I think you probably know this anecdotally, spending a lot more time online than we did just a few years ago. In fact, if you looked back to, say, 2014, the research company Nielsen did this, and they found that we were spending about 9 hours and 32 minutes a day consuming content online. That's everything from writing emails to watching Game of Thrones on a streaming through your phone or whatever it might be, to listening to Spotify and what have you. About 9 hours and 32 minutes. Just last year, it leapt forward exponentially. The average American adult now spends 10 hours and 39 minutes a day consuming ideas and information online. And that's a really, really extraordinary thing, and obviously poses a lot of questions. Perhaps the biggest one is, for those of us in the business of doing good, how do you break through? How do you break through? Well, that's the question that we're going to try to answer over the next hour. So we're going to cover design's role in increasing your credibility and your ability to persuade. We're going to talk about how you can organize and present your content for greater clarity for people who are, frankly, often distracted and not paying nearly as much attention as you might like. How to create greater context and deeper meaning for the audiences that you're drawing. How to deliver memorable takeaways and encourage people to stay with what you're producing longer. And then finally, how to produce your content in ways that are flexible so that it can be used on lots of different channels. So what you're making that works on Facebook can be repurposed to work on Twitter or on your website or any number of different places. It's not magic. There's extra strategy and thought behind this, and we're going to hear a little bit more about that. But before we get underway, just a couple quick logistical items. If you've been with us before, I'm sorry if I sound like a broken record. We have a full house once again today. Hundreds of folks have signed up. So we're going to try to take as many questions as we can. And you can use the chat box in the lower left-hand corner of your screen to do so. If you walked in the door with a burning question, guess what? You should probably put that question in here now. We're going to get to some questions fairly soon. If you're going to be joining us on Twitter, as a good group of you do every time here, we're going to be organizing ourselves around the ComNetLive hashtag. That's hashtag ComNetLive, ComNetLive. You can use that to share some of the top lines you're hearing from the session, your own thoughts and impressions. And, of course, we welcome you to ask questions through Twitter as well. We're going to be taking those questions across the hour throughout this presentation. And as we always do, this webinar is going to be recorded, and we'll post it up online at comnetwork.org for free replays within the next, call it, week or so. So thanks again for joining us. I now get to hand it off to Matt and Sonongo. Gentlemen, why don't you take us away?
Excellent. Thank you, Sean, and thank you, both you, Sean, and Tristan, for just the amazing work that you do. And as I stated, so appreciative of how much support you generate for the work that organizations like us do, and rallying people around, helping them to communicate more effectively. And thank you, absolutely, everybody who made time out of their day to join us. As you mentioned today, our discussion is Engage, Persuade, Motivate. It's going to be about digital content and design. And just to give you a quick overview, we like to do this and give you a sense of how things are going to unfold. We've got 3 areas we're going to talk through, talking about engagement broadly and understanding it a bit better, talking about how to create engagement, specifically digitally, obviously. We're going to take a little break then for about maybe 5 to 10 minutes of questions, and then we're going to get into some practical practical thinking about designing digital content. And if you've attended one of our sessions before, you will know that this will be pretty fast-paced. We like to cover a lot of ground. We like to give you a lot to think about. It's our hope in doing these kinds of sessions that you walk away with, yes, helpful things that you can put directly into action, hopefully, but more importantly for us is understanding something that you didn't know about as much before and walking away thinking, I need to know more about that, and hopefully providing some jumping off points and an ability for you to explore more deeply things that will be relevant to you. And so hopefully this provides that springboard. So before we jump into things, maybe we can go more quickly here and just introduce ourselves, and I'll hand it over to Sanango.
Hey everybody, this is Sanango. I'm the design director here at Constructive. I've been building websites for a long time, since probably the advent of the web standards kind of movement, so that's around 2005 or so. And work here focusing on content strategy, visual design, and branding for the studio. And so I'm going to be helping Matt through the presentation and helping to answer any questions that come up as we go through.
And I'm Matt. I'm the founder and director of strategy of the firm. I'm a little bit more gray in the beard, as you can see by the photo. I've been at this working. I got my start in digital actually in '95. It's kind of about the advent of the commercial internet, and have been working exclusively for the last 17 years when I founded Constructive with social change organizations on brand strategy and digital design. One of the things that we do in our practice is focus on the bridge between developing brand strategy and positioning and messaging and applying that thinking to digital. I do want to say that I'm going to be the main presenter here. Sanango and I have worked on this together for some time, and we actually gave this as a workshop with the Foundation Center. It was a presentation and a hands-on workshop. So his thinking is a big part of this, and he'll probably drop in and out to provide some extra comments, and he'll be here for questions. And with that, let's talk about engagement. Let's talk about the idea of what engagement is about. It seems to be sort of an overused term maybe, but it all starts with your website, right? Here's your website, and as a digital communicator, you think a lot about your website. It's probably one of the most important things about your job if you are working in digital communications. And you spend countless hours thinking about this thing right here that's in the middle of the screen, what content to put on your site, how to make that content more accessible, make sure that it works on mobile, making sure that your site's well designed overall and reflects your brand, making sure your content is relevant. Ultimately working day and night to make sure your website supports your organizational strategy, and then it makes a meaningful contribution to advancing your mission, right? That's what it's about ultimately. And of course, if you're a social change organization, you also hope that all of this hard work pays off and contributes to making a positive difference in the world. And while I don't want to dampen your enthusiasm with all of this immense time and effort that you put into this, you're not the only one who thinks like that. And there are actually, at this point, if you can believe it, 1,225,274,374 websites, and that's as of this morning. And so not only are there a lot of websites, over 1 billion competing for people's time and attention, but in a social change space that has seen incredible growth in the last 2 decades. I mean, 25% more nonprofits in the United States alone. This means that there are countless people just like you who are working on digital communications to make sure that their websites are doing the same exact things that yours do and trying to accomplish much of the same goals. And really, as digital communication experts, you also know that your website is just one touch point in this sort of online engagement dynamic. The social media space is huge and a big part of probably what a lot of you do. And other websites in your sector, other industry-related websites like ComNet, for example, your partners perhaps, if you have grantees, you name it. They all are contributing in one way, shape, or form to this intense competition for our attention, ultimately. And so, amazingly, after thousands of years of engaging with content in analog, if you will, right, more linear, think of kind of like Homer's Odyssey as the traditional content and storyline, the way things, maybe go back to hieroglyphics, right? more physical content. Well, in the last 20 years, digital communications broadly and social media specifically have dramatically changed our relationship with information. And it's really changed how humanity engages with ideas and how we communicate with one another. It's a totally different environment in 20 short years than the one we've been used to for thousands. And just to demonstrate this, since 2000, the average attention span has dropped to 8 seconds, shorter than a goldfish. Microsoft did this survey a few years ago of over 2,000 participants that included studying the brain activity using electroencephalograms. And what they found was that attention span was down to 8 seconds, shorter than a goldfish. And the big takeaway here for digital communications, and if you work in digital communications, is that their assessment was that heavy multi-screeners find it difficult to filter out irrelevant stimuli. And I'm sure we can all relate, right? We're more easily distracted by multiple streams of media. And so while obviously digital has brought incredible promise and has brought a ton to us in terms of our ability to accomplish things and communicate with one another and collaborate and connect, well, the side effect is that we have just a totally different mindset when it comes to engaging with content and engaging with ideas. And so what is it ultimately that makes online engagement so challenging? Well, there are a sender and a receiver, of course, every time. And when we think about it, you've got people who are starved for time. They have chronic ADD and message overload. We're spoiled for choice when it comes to the types of options we have for different areas where we can get content. We ultimately have trust issues, right? This year alone, the idea of fake news and what's credible has absolutely, it never more has credibility on the web been more important and more front and center. And there are countless channels that if you're a publisher, you have to understand how to deal with and what to do with them. And you have multiple audiences, but not only do you have multiple audiences, very often you're communicating to multiple audiences with kind of the same content, right? It's singular content, but you have to connect with people who have different interests and different levels of fluency. And information moves really fast, which means you have to remain relevant. And then technology is changing on you on top of it, right? It's not easy to keep abreast of everything. And I'm sure a lot of you have had to deal with really crummy tools, right? A CMS, for example, that just kind of sucks to deal with. It makes your life really tough. And maybe your website isn't so hot, right? On top of all of it, a website might not be designed well. So whether you're sending out the messages as a communicator, whether you're the author, as it were, or whether you're the audience, there are a lot of challenges here. And ultimately online, decisions about what content to pay attention to and how long to engage with it are made extremely quickly. You've got probably a few seconds for someone to come to a determination if they don't know anything about you, about what their impression is, right? And then maybe they're encouraged to explore. And the Stanford Web Credibility Project sort of indicated that design and the idea of how credibility is communicated online, design is an incredibly important part of that. And so brand credibility and trust and visual design all work together to determine how worthy of our time and attention your content is, right? And how valuable is what you have to say and offer to me. And people act accordingly from there, right? And so when we think about this digital landscape and we think about the way content is right now, ultimately what we have is what I call the 3S, right? We have a world that's awash in this endless content that's really fast, incredibly fragmented, and it's free form, right? It's non-linear. And so what this means is that we are increasingly getting content in short bursts. They're disconnected very often from one another, and we can go in any direction we want depending on our own interests, right? If you used to read a report or you read something like Homer's Odyssey, that was the way you consumed content or a narrative. Well, now it's kind of more like a choose-your-own-adventure book, and if you add the digital sort of ADD component, it's like somebody who's on speed trying to make sense of all this stuff. And so this is the world that everybody has to deal with if they're in digital communications. We're kind of all in the same boat if you're a digital communicator. However, of course, social change organizations, as they do with a lot of things, unfortunately, seemingly have a heavier lift than most when it comes to sustaining online engagement. But why specifically, right? And I think there are a couple things when it comes specifically to content and engaging with content and ideas and communication. And the first is that our ideas are really complicated. The issues are complicated. They're complex. It's not a quick value proposition that someone can act on, right? You need to sort of understand things in a much more deeper, more holistic, more well-rounded sense. There's a lot of context that's required. And very often, the things that social change organizations are talking about and that we're trying to communicate about are kind of occurring in these faraway places, right? As I like to say, social change organizations are often trying to make a difference for, as far as the audience is concerned, things that are happening in faraway places, perhaps in the future, for people that we don't actually know. We appeal to our better angels, to our altruistic sense of why we should pay attention and get involved. And that ultimately means that things are removed from our daily lives, right? There's less of a sense of urgency to act sometimes than there is, obviously, if someone offers a service that I actually have a real need for. And so ultimately that means that social change requires us to focus on things that are inherently more difficult to engage with online. And if we think about this idea about how fragmented things are and our 8-second attention span and the way things have changed in the last 20 years, well, that is a heavy lift indeed. And so if that's, what does this mean ultimately? Why it is important that we are trying to inform, motivate audiences? Well, ultimately, whether you're an organization that deals with poverty or is addressing healthcare or thinking about civil rights or education or immigration or prison, incarceration, climate change, or just innovation and new ideas, well, the voices that we respect, remember, and return to are the ones that help shape how we understand our world. Ultimately, that's what communications are about, right? And we draw upon the voices that we're interested in to help deepen our own understanding and bring our own thinking to it. And so these voices are the ones who are most likely to spur us to action, right? And whether that means, from an engagement standpoint, sharing our content, which is a simple act perhaps, or showing support, whether that's maybe volunteering or donating money, or just showing up, right? Sometimes civic action requires just being there and being present. Well, the voices that we respect, remember, and return to are the ones that are more likely to spur us to get engaged that way. And ultimately, all of these fragmented experiences with our content are about, they kind of work collectively, right, to create the relationship that audiences have with our brands. And ultimately, that relationship, those individual interactions that happen over time, well, they determine the kind of engagement that we can expect, both now and in the future. And as a result, the kind of impact that you can have online as a result. But what does it take to be respected, first of all, if these are the three things that are most important to spurring people to action? Well, for us, we think a lot about brand, right? And for us, ultimately, credibility, your expertise and authority to lead, and your integrity, right? These are the things that respected social brands are built on. And when an organization has a strong sense of shared values and a clear mission that's directed towards a common purpose, right, that tends to create a lot of respect for you as an organization. And that's kind of step one, right? But then step two, right, what does it take to actually be remembered? Well, this gets more into the realm of actual communications and the image that you portray from your sense of identity and the work you do and your common purpose, right? And that's projecting things with great clarity and having a great cohesion in how you communicate those things, and ultimately doing that consistently, right? Because articulating your ideas with cohesion and clarity is the kind of thing that lets you stand for something that people remember you for. And then ultimately, for people to return to you to say, this is important to me and you are important to me and I need to understand things more deeply and have a better relationship and have deeper engagement, well, you need to be differentiated for people to come back. You have to offer something of value that's really important to your audience, and it's got to be enjoyable, right? And again, if we're thinking about our websites online, our websites are about content, and so we need to offer differentiated content and experiences that are valuable and that are enjoyable. But what it ultimately takes, that is engagement, right? This sort of intangible, somewhat difficult to quantify, elusive thing that a lot of us talk about. We're seeking it. It's a bit of the holy grail, right? As digital communicators, we're not only looking for engagement, we're actually looking to see how we can measure and understand engagement. And that's a big thing. And hopefully, by understanding the principles of what it means to actually drive engagement online and how engagement works in the digital space, we can get into the ideas of talking about creating engagement. And so that's what we're going to do right here. And so for about 10 minutes now, we're going to talk about creating engagement for audiences online. And after that 10 minutes, we're going to have a little break, as I noted. We'll take some questions, so I hope you'll send those on in, and we'll really look forward to answering those. And again, if you use the hashtag or you hit us directly on Twitter, and our handle is down on the bottom, we will answer for you as well and get back to you. So thank you for that. So when it comes to creating engagement, back to this idea again, the reason people come to your website, that thing we started the presentation with, that you spend tons of your time thinking about how to build around and then sort of spread out onto the digital landscape, well, the reason people come to your website in the first place is content, right? And the reason they pay attention to you on social media, it's all of these things, is to access your content. And so to be engaging, digital content has to be meaningful to people, back to this idea of brand and understanding your relationship with audiences and what they need and want out of you, kind of stuff you also look at when you're doing user experience design, audience goals, they're called, right? And it has to deliver value. And the important thing is in the digital landscape, as we all know now, right, it has to happen wherever and however people consume it. And back to this 20-year change in digital, as folks who develop and design experiences online for folks, and I've been doing this since '95, I mean, 6 or 7 years ago, it was optional for people to budget for the added work of making sure their website was responsive on mobile. It's pretty amazing, but it wasn't that long ago that some sites were responsive, others weren't, and now it's just something you have to do, right? So that's incredibly important for us to keep in mind when we think about what it means to be able to connect with folks wherever they are and whatever devices they like to engage with us on. And so we can think about this idea of websites and the content, and that's why people show up, right? To say, what is digital content? What's content? And I think, it seems like something that would be an easy question to answer, and I don't think it's that difficult. I think it's important to point out that digital content, yes, it's very often thought about, we have to create content, right? A lot of people think about they got to write their content. That's the biggest lift. God, we have so much content to write for our website. We're doing this redesign, and I don't know how on earth we're going to get all this content written, never mind get it written well. But it's not just that, right? It's also images, it's video, it's audio, it's presentations, it's actual design elements, it's things like infographics, it's data visualization and charts, right? It's even animation when you think about digital. Our content is an awful lot, right? It's a heck of a lot more than just a written word, and it's important that when we think about our content, that we think always about all of these things and how they will work together to create that kind of differentiated engagement and different experiences that are meaningful and valuable and have impact and that engage audiences, because each one of these is actually as important as the other. They may not all be appropriate for your own strategy or your goals, but each one is equally as important to be considered. But then you got to deal with all these file formats, right? There's a ton of them. And so you don't have to just think about actually the kinds of content you're going to create when you think about digital. You have to think about how it's going to actually be delivered as far as just a file format goes, and that changes back to this idea of different technology and keeping abreast of all of that. Well, it's a lot to keep up with. And so when we think about creating engagement with content, I like to try and simplify it actually. While content is all these things, I think ultimately it really is these two things, right? And again, you've got an author on one side and an audience on the other, and I think we can we like to break content down to this idea of style and substance. And so on the style side, we sort of think about it this way here at the studio, and that is kind of storytelling and then academic content. We deal with a lot of both of these, and they are different, right? And they share things, but storytelling emphasizes ideas of emotion, uses metaphor a lot more, and it uses those things, whether it's written, again, or visual, to communicate and persuade folks, to create engagement, to create impact. Academic content, the kind of stuff that research obviously is based on, if you do policy reports and things of that nature, think tank work, well, it emphasizes focusing on rigor and process, right, to communicate and persuade. It's about advancing an argument, if you will, or a perspective or a point of view, and it's about doing so in ways that lay a step-by-step case for that style. So that style is just different. And they're bits of both in each, but I think they both are fundamentally different. And then when we think about substance, well, look, you've got, first of all, types of, which we just talked about, from images to written, etc. You've got all these formats that we talked about, but the important thing here then to say is that it's also online. It's all of these things in every variation. And this is where we get into this idea of repackaged content, of how we use content in different ways, the same content to attract and engage different people, right? You can have a full article, but you could also have an abstract or an executive summary. You can have the full video, and you can have smaller clips. You can have audio, but then you could also have a transcript, right? And all of these things comes down to what style of content do you have, what kind of information, and what's the substance of it, what type and format is it. And so when we think about that kind of content, we then think about what are the ways that it is ultimately engaging. And again, we like to simplify this stuff down so that we stay focused on what's most important. Of course, there are more details in doing this kind of work, but I think as digital communicators, it's really important to think about, first of all, content relevance, right? And for us, the relevancy of content, the relevancy of our ideas, ultimately, and our mission as social change organizations is it's intangible. And it's primarily influenced by ideas of brand. As folks who work on brand strategy a lot, we deal with thinking about those kinds of things and why ideas would be relevant. And of course, design plays a critical role in conveying relevancy, right? Because it can help us signal to us visually whether something is worth paying attention. But ultimately, relevancy is a little bit more intangible. And then you've got this idea of, okay, as I talked about earlier, credibility. What is the perceived quality and trustworthiness of the content? The higher those are, the more relevant they are. And design does influence that as well. There's context of our ideas and our content online. What is that context? Both within your organization and your brand and the work that you do and in the greater societal context, which again, back to these complex issues that social change organizations need to tackle. But then also for me, right? Why is this meaningful to me? Why is it valuable to me? We need to signal these things to communicate relevancy. And then perspective, right? The greater the perspective of our specialized expertise, the differentiation that we bring as an organization, whether it's our approach and our methods and our theory of change, or whether it's just our style and our voice, those things contribute to the relevancy. And then the usefulness of our content is the second plank for engagement, right? You kind of need to be relevant first for people to pay attention to you. But then you've got this idea of the tangible nature of content's usefulness. And it's primarily influenced through design. And it's important, though, to say, again, as we talked about, consistency does increase trust factors, as Stanford has proven in their research, right? And so, but when we think about this tangible utility of content, right, how accessible is it? And that comes down to things like information architecture and how well organized is it, how intuitive is it for me to engage it, how legible is it, readable, things like typography that are really important to that. How transportable is it for me? The speed, right? How focused is the content itself? How quickly do I get the message? And then how actionable is it, right? What can I actually do with this stuff? That helps me understand the utility of content, and when you combine high relevancy of content and super high utility of content, well, I think you've got a much greater chance of engaging with content. Now, the background on this slide seems to have faded out. You can see Nancy Duarte here, something in Ready Talk, but nonetheless, would like to say this quote here I think is incredibly important, right? You've got much of our communication today exhibits the quality of intangibility, often more conceptual than concrete and more ephemeral than firm. And I think that this has been a really important statement for me. It's something that I think is really valuable when we think about content and design. And that's because, yes, our ideas are more conceptual than they are concrete. And for social change organizations, again, when we think about the ideas of complex issues, complicated content, stuff that is removed from our daily lives, even more abstract, right, could be in the future. Those are very intangible things that we're trying to engage people with. And so when we're communicating complex concepts such as a strategic model, a theory of change, or effective design ultimately firms up ideas in people's minds. That's its job. And design, as a result, increases their clarity, the ideas that we have, our content, by making them easier to understand, making them easier to remember, and making them easier to work with. And so why is design so important then? If we talk about designing our content and designing for engagement, this is how we design and create engagement. And this is kind of a quick primer on the idea of the theory of how design translates ideas, content into actionable stuff. And design itself has been described as strategy made visible, which I think is a really great way to describe it, because it explains its role in strategic communications and in developing brands, ultimately, because brand communications are about creating experiences around an exchange of value. And so design, strategy, ultimately, designs value, right? You have two sides of a coin when you think about a relationship, when you think about communication between an author and an audience. When you think of a brand dynamic, you've got your perspective and the audience has their perspective. And you set strategy up at the top, right? And that strategy helps define your value. And ultimately, strategy is expressed through design, right? That's on the organizational side of things. It's your perspective. It's how you project your image. And audiences then engage with your ideas, with your content through that design, through those things that are expressed. And sort of ipso facto, right? Design makes strategy and the value that you offer tangible. And that is ultimately what this is all about. And to illustrate that point, before we go into the break, I'll just show you quickly. See for yourself here. Who are you more likely to give your time to as an organization here? Whose ideas are you more likely to explore? What's more compelling here? Who's more likely to motivate you to act? And who here provides the most actionable insights? Well, you can probably tell that these are before and after shots of websites where the previous version and the version after hopefully illustrate the significant difference in terms of our willingness and want to engage with content ideas that are built around social change and complex concepts. And what that ultimately means is that design has great power to help social change organizations elevate issues, steer conversations, strengthen credibility, and generate support to effect meaningful change. You know, again, our websites are about making our content and our ideas more available, more useful, and it's about building brand relationships through these designed experiences that are centered around content, that are about engaging people and delivering value. And so with that, I'll hand it back to Tristan and Sean quickly, and Sinago and I look forward to spending maybe about the next 5 to 10 minutes answering a few questions, and then we've got one more section to talk about.
Oh, what? I wasn't paying attention. No, I'm just kidding. Let's get to them. I just proved your point, right? Nicole asked.
Exactly. Thank you.
Well, I'll be here all day, folks. I struggle with creating calls to action, or even more important, calls to converse. So that's not centered on asks or solicitations, but how do I use digital to create a conversation and not just deliver one-way messages? Boy, that's the $100,000 question, isn't it?
So one of the things that we work on here is, specifically that, like how do we, as Matt was saying, motivate people to act? And there are, of course, kind of the end points, the things that we want people to achieve on our site at the very, the end of a conversion funnel, for example. So one of those might be to donate money to an organization. But there's also other secondary things which help to support that. So another call to action might be sign up for the newsletter. And so the things that we do and the way that we think about it are to define what those endpoints might be, and we know that there's always going to be more than one. And then we start to build the content, the images, animations, if it might be something which is visually interesting, that help to get people to that specific point. So the thing that everybody perhaps hates right now on the web is the newsletter pop-ups where it's like sign up for our newsletter. So even though they might be super annoying, the point is made that that's the end of a particular funnel. That's a call to action. But it's not the only one on the site. And so building things like visual elements that help to direct people's eyes to that. So the newsletter area is probably a different color. Making sure that buttons are large and clickable on web and on mobile are some of the design things that we can do to help facilitate those calls to action being effective.
And if I can just add to that also to answer Nicole's question here, I think sometimes it's also important to understand that depending on the nature of your organization, its work, and the relationship to your audiences, conversation online through digital, specifically through your website, may not actually be something that is either a great idea to invest in and isn't going to happen. Social channels may be more effective for that. We've had many times where, back in the day in particular, a client would want to create a forum and have lots of comments on their site. But the reality is, unless they spend the time to cultivate it, it wouldn't actually take off because it wasn't necessarily what the audience needed. So it's always important to think about that and make sure.
And another thing to add to that, and something that you see happening in online culture today, if you are a comic book nerd or you like that sort of thing, is the fan fiction that gets created, the immense popularity of Comic-Cons. And so one of the things that happens is we need to give our audience permission to remix and rethink the ways that our content and maybe the conversation should go. We don't always need to be the ones to control that. I think that may be a downfall, especially of smaller organizations where they'd like to be in the lead and like to manage the questions and the answers. But in reality, you need to allow people the freedom and the permission to perhaps do other things with it. And that's where that conversation starts, is they're talking to each other and maybe not necessarily to you. So just an idea from the real world is how popular comic book culture is and how they work with each other rather than the comic book publishers.
Yeah, I think that's actually just to nerd up on you guys a little bit. Natalie Kylander has written extensively on this when she's talking about branding. You may know her. She works, I think, still these days at the Harvard Business School. But one of the things she talks about is this idea that for those folks who are charged with leading or managing brands, one of the single biggest challenges is letting go, is deputizing and evangelizing and allowing people to have permission to take your work and make it their own. And that's where you get those authentic conversations. And oftentimes, they don't want to talk to you. They want to talk about you with their friends. A couple other questions, in fact, a number of questions. So let's see if we can get to at least a few of them here. We'll pass a few back into the of the session here. Kimberly asks, do you have a general opinion about the volume of text on a website? So are you generally in favor of fewer words and the use of more or other types of content for maximum engagement? I have a thought here, but I'm sure you guys have actual data.
Well, the worst answer in the world is it depends. So let's take the two extremes. One extreme is the type of client that we work with who they are research-based organizations. They do, let's say, climate change research. Their papers are peer-reviewed and probably checked and triple-checked by scientists and so on. So they have a lot of words that they need to get on their sites. Now, based on what they do and the way that their organization is, that's the most effective for them. You can take other organizations, let's say Charity Water, another very, very popular one, have a great design aesthetic, and they have some stories on their sites of successful things that they've done, and those are largely image-based. So the images have captions, maybe a pull quote here or there, but they use very few words to communicate the impact that they're having, and people engage with those just as well. So I would say decide on what it is exactly that your organization or foundation or nonprofit is really focusing on, and that should start to give you a good idea of the amount of words. Is it a story that you want to tell? Maybe fewer words. Or is it more academic? Probably more words.
And to add to that, as Santiago said, I think the different goals for different organizations matter. But ultimately, this is a perfect example, I think, of where design matters. Design quality matters. There's a reason why we as a species have spent thousands of years and centuries when it comes to the idea of understanding things like typography and legibility of type and things like line spacing and what the optimal amount of characters per line is. And not only that, if you are a content-heavy organization, and we work with a lot of folks who do have heavy publishing needs, it's a big thing for us, design and chunking of information and using good typographic fundamentals to keep the reading rhythm engaging and to also provide what we call top-level takeaways and then encourage deeper dives and use best practices from editorial design. If you think about in the pre-digital world just what really great magazine design looked like, for example, and looked like, there are practices there that are the fundamentals that designers live and breathe their entire professional lives. And those things are the types of devices and approaches that can help you achieve more with heavy content by breaking it up and making it easier for people to engage with and actually find ways online to turn it into stuff that can be actionable and put to use.
Okay, a couple more questions and then we'll move on, trying to be mindful of time. Our friend Aaron from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation says, what are some valuable tools or approaches that you all have used to define your target audiences and to better understand their needs? And Delia, sort of related question, says, chicken and egg question, what comes first, the audience you want or the engagement strategy you need to reach them?
I think that is chicken and egg. I would say I want to know who I'm talking to, and I want to know what their interests are. We do a lot of user research, and that's not usability per se, but who the actual audience is. That's one of the first things that we need to identify when we're working with the client. And based on that, we can start to figure out ways that the content can engage in what they want. And really, the model of the internet being that the user, the community is out there and they have their own needs and their wants, and those are probably much more important than the organization. So identifying who the audience is first, to me, feels like a much more natural way to approach it.
And if I can add, I think this is a good example of where our approach and focus on, even if we're not engaged by an organization to do brand strategy work and help to sort of define and develop some of that positioning and differentiation to help advance their strategy as an organization, that kind of thinking makes its way into digital. And I will say that I've increasingly found over the years how the work of UX design and the tools and methods and goals are so similar to brand strategy and the kinds of things you're trying to uncover. And so I would say ultimately that figuring out what engagement strategy is very much the part of understanding the audience and understanding what we call sort of like the gives and the gets, right? In every relationship, when you think of your different audiences, a healthy relationship is an exchange of mutual value where everyone gives something of value and gets something of value in return. And whether we're doing brand strategy to define audiences or doing user research and defining that for just digital. We're very focused on trying to understand those types of needs and where that exchange of value is, because I think your engagement strategy then is based on what's important and memorable to folks and also what they're looking for from you, and then you can drive engagement that way.
All right. A number of other questions. We'll do our best, I promise, to get there, but I think in the interest of being mindful of everybody else's time, let's keep moving forward.
And again, honestly, please, we will keep note of all of these and we will respond to you on Twitter. We promise. All right. So let's talk about designing with digital content. We talked about the theory of engagement broadly and sort of how the digital landscape has transformed what it means to be engaged with content, with information, with ideas. We've talked about the ideas of how this happens online and design's role specifically in creating that engagement. But we want to finish up here, and then we'll have time for questions at the end, with a quick overview of how we actually design with digital content. Now, this is a big topic that could easily be its own session, so we're not going to pretend to cover the bases fully here, but hopefully what we'll do, again, is give you really good food for thought, ideas that you can dig more deeply into, and hopefully expand your own learning. So ultimately, again, right, content's the reason that people are visiting your website. That's what our websites are about. They're about making our content, our ideas available and more useful. Now, I think what's important to know when we think about content, yes, we need to design for engagement. Yes, there are many tools when it comes to how digital works to accomplish that. But ultimately, high-quality content, emphasis on high quality, that is also accessible, enjoyable, and valuable, is the foundation for establishing these strong relationships with our audiences. It's so critical that sites have a strategy to actually develop and provide that content in whatever measure they can manage, right? There is an operational reality here for certain organizations when resources are thin, and we'll talk about that a bit at the end. But ultimately, that high-quality content is the foundation, and it has to be accessible, enjoyable, and valuable. And to do that, ultimately, it has to be designed. And that means that what we need is a content-driven design process for digital experiences. It's not anything, this isn't groundbreaking in one way, right? Of course, you need to design content. But historically, especially when design was taking off as a discipline up until maybe we hit the 21st century, the idea of design was that it was sort of like beautification and decoration that was added at the end, right? Strategy was set, people might develop content into things, and then they would send it to a designer, right? And they would be brought in. And I think we've all understand now that design's role and what design actually is far more than just visual, right? Our explanation that we like is that design is really just about taking existing situations and turning them into preferred ones. And when it comes to designing with your content, we use the ideas of content to drive how we think about design, and we use design to influence how we think about content. And so we have 5 principles that we focus on that are the most important. And the first is the idea of focusing attention. And this is at the high level. You can think about things like information architecture. If you've done a website engagement, you might understand that. It's also things like, again, editorial design, focused layout, use of white space, moving someone's eye and mind through the content, right? That structure and those visual cues, that's what helps people understand how to access our content. And so our content needs to be thought of as in its relationship to design and vice versa to help do that. And ultimately, we have to provide context, again, especially in a fragmented environment where stuff is being consumed quickly in short bursts. We need to always try to create context, build relationships between our ideas to the bigger picture, and that in turn helps give them deeper meaning, both in, for example, helping someone understand how one thing that you've shared with them works with regard to how your programs operate and how you make change in the world, or how it relates to them in their relationship to your organization. Adding perspective, right? This goes back to this brand idea. The unique expertise and perspective of your brand gives content deeper meaning and greater value. And similarly, it's critical that our content be focused on how can we add perspective to the content we're sharing, and when we're designing with it, how do we highlight that perspective? We have to connect emotionally. I mean, I think that goes without saying, right? But words, visual, sound, they all work together to help attract attention and create greater impact. And then ultimately, we talked about this utility, right? We need to invite action. Calls to action that motivate audiences to use our content, to invest themselves in supporting our mission. So if we think about focusing people's attention, providing broader context so they have a deeper understanding, adding some unique perspective during the experience and through our content, connecting with them emotionally so it resonates and feels meaningful to them, and then inviting them to action. Well, that's how our content needs to work, and that's how our design needs to work, and those things have to work hand in glove. And so when we publish content online to our websites, the thing that's important when we think about how do we create this stuff is that we're publishing it for an almost endless variety of different contexts. That's what's changed with digital. And some of these contexts may not even exist yet at the time that we're publishing it. And I'll go back to that idea of responsive design, right? If your site was created before mobile took off, but not that long before it, you didn't know mobile was going to become huge, and therefore your site wasn't responsive. That's a tall order, but we need to sort of think about this. We're publishing it in that reality. And these experiences occur over time, and these brand relationships are built over time. And so again, if we think about fast, fragmented, free-form content, we have to think about how it's going to be experienced in these different settings, how our content will be both delivered and received on every device, in every location, and in every context. And what that means is that our digital content has to be flexible. If you work in the industry as a designer and as a content strategist, flexible content is a thing, and it's important. And ultimately, it kind of means this, right? At its heart, flexible content is just about responding to the shift in control over how, where, and when content is consumed by separating content from where it's presented. So separating content delivery and presentation is more important than ever. And we're now shifting from pages to collections of context elements that are repurposable, flexible content elements. So what we refer to as pages on the web really are collections of content. It used to be you would design full pages and review full page designs of comps of your entire site. Well, we don't really do that much anymore. We do it a little bit, and then we focus on the different elements and think about how they're going to be repurposed and reused, especially on different devices. And that's so that we can plan for our content to live on the web at large. And so when we take a content-first or content-driven approach to design, and then we think about how to make our content reusable and flexible, it makes it easier for us to develop a more effective content strategy and then design experiences that ultimately are going to be better aligned with what our audiences need and are looking for and when they're looking for it. And then, of course, to be better aligned with your brand goals and your organizational goals in terms of engaging folks. And so flexible content means shifting this idea of authoring content to modeling content. And, you know, I think as designers and strategists, Anango and I think differently about content than we do when we're actually authoring it. And we both write a lot of content, and it's really interesting. As writers, I think when we're writing articles for our insights section of our website or our newsletter, we have a very different mindset. And then when we're working with clients on a project, we just approach it differently. And so in a nutshell, what we're trying to do when we think about our content and think about how it will be designed, we're taking a more holistic view of all these many places and uses for the content. And we try to consider this bigger picture, and then we dig down into these granular details. And by doing it through this lens, we're better able to account for all of our content types, the individual elements that make up these content types, and all of that which is needed to communicate with our content. And so content modeling is the approach that we take, and it seeks to increase engagement with our content, strengthen its clarity and meaning, and increase its effectiveness in supporting our mission by creating these different content elements. And there are three of them that we sort of break content down into when we're looking at it. And so flexible content models, when we think about them, first of all, we've got macro content. And this is some of the stuff I talked about earlier when we were talking about sort of different formats and such, right? These are the largest building blocks of our content. And these are the things that work together to communicate our message. And so these are the things that I think we all readily understand and grasp, right? Text, video, audio, illustrations, data visualizations, animations, all of these things are the macro content, the biggest building blocks of the things that we need to communicate through the digital space. Then we have this stuff called micro content. And for us, micro content is all of these smaller sub-elements. So I go back to this idea of editorial design. But in digital, it's not just this idea of, yes, we have pull quotes and we have display paragraphs, we have abstracts and summaries, statistics, takeaways, titles, all of these things, short titles that may need to show up in the sidebar, the full title. It's not just editorial in nature, because you could do that in a magazine. There's nothing that much different about these things. What's different is the way you model and build it on the back end in your database and the way your content management system is architected in order to control that content and make it more flexible and repurposable. That is very different. And I go back to this idea of we're not building pages anymore. If any of you have a website with a CMS that has like a single WYSIWYG editor that you sort of like have to drop in your text and sort of figure out how to make it look good, well, you know the pain of trying to make a single page of content look good, never mind keep it consistent across an entire experience, never mind on a phone versus a desktop, right? Well, we think about this micro content in ways that can be built into technology to make it more repurposable, and that's incredibly important. And then this third part is this, what we call invisible content. And this is this structural stuff and it's technical stuff that helps organize your content. It works behind the scenes to organize it, support it. It displays it in other places like search engines, and even when you think of when you post something to social media, that metadata that's pulled in and how it's displayed, well, that's actually different than what a search engine shows when it shows a result. And that's different than the micro content and the way things are organized and highlighted in your own website, which is designed for you and your brand, right? But things like content taxonomies, content types, tags, keywords, customizing the titles of your SEO listings and your descriptions and your social listings and metadata, all that stuff is invisible, but it's built into, it's part of your content, and it is the third plank. So this macro content, micro content, and invisible content. When we model content and design with it, we are thinking about those things both from a communications and a design perspective, from a technology perspective, and then a how it's received in the digital space in different environments perspective. So you can understand now, hopefully, about this more holistic view. And so to highlight that visually, try to sort of give an example of what that would look like a bit here. And here's a really long page from a site that we did about a year ago. And here's an example of how something, when it's built, it's kind of like diagramming a sentence, right? In this one area, we've got a content type listed up top for a report. We have a full article. We have the author's names, which are actual items in their own right. We have our tags, which are available, which is some of that invisible content. We have a display paragraph. We have the primary content in the body itself. We even have a hero image in this case, which in some instances might be a full image, and in other instances in the site might be a thumbnail. We have content sections, right? So this content is broken up into subsections. It has a table of contents. It has different sections. There are citations for this content. It's research-heavy content. There are funding sources that need to be listed, and this content might be organized by that and other content. We have key takeaways. We have data visualization. There's a full title for that data visualization, and then there's a short title actually in other instances. There are footnotes that are actually in the database and separate and are accessible here and actually repurposable as endnotes. There is a pull quote, and that pull quote isn't just something that's inline in here. Well, it's something that's made dynamic so that it can be shared with a click via social media, and it can also be repurposed, repackaged, and put into other places to highlight top-level takeaways. And there are things like infographics. And all of these are constructed, modeled, and thought of in ways that relate together. So, yeah, hopefully this is interesting stuff, but how exactly we get here? And we're going to spend the next about 2 minutes explaining that and giving you just a sense of what it takes to sort of change how you think and do to work this way, right? And so making the switch to digital content, ultimately it's about process and tools. You're an organization, you work in teams, you need a process and tools to support it. And so on the process side, right, the way we need to think about it, if you're making this switch, what's important is how does your entire organization and your partners, right? If you're a foundation and you have grantees that you need to collect content from and let them know how to provide it, well, that's really important to figure out how your content's created. So you need to focus on and understand your team structure, where your strengths are, what your capabilities are. You need to think about content governance, right? Who owns what parts of what content and who has authority to push, publish, authorize. What are your editorial standards? That process is going to change based on the way you think about constructing and modeling content versus just this authoring in a Microsoft Word document. And that, of course, is going to change your editorial and your publishing workflows. And the process side then, of course, leads to what tools do we have to support those things? And how do we publish our content? Well, things like an editorial calendar that helps guide people along and make sure you stay focused on it. A content matrix, which is something we create to get very granular about these different micro and macro elements and paste them in a spreadsheet. Those are really helpful. The content management system, the biggest tool of all, right, when it comes to your website anyway. How is it built? How is it architected in order to make the ability to have this flexible, repurposable content more easy to use? Usability matters on the back end. Your users, we say admins are users too, and we need to design our technology to be as mindful of them as we are for the folks who are visiting our websites. And of course, documentation, a really important tool. So this all seems like it'd be a great idea just because having better, more engaging content that advances our mission is important, right? There's no doubt about that. But in closing, if that isn't enough to suggest or to spur you to make the case for approaching things more holistically this way, what are other benefits, right? Well, first of all, you've got greater brand consistency. When you develop content strategically this way and then the technology you use on the back end to store it and publish it to different places and devices and being mindful of the design systems that help make it adjust for different environments, well, that creates consistency, right? And we know that greater consistency builds trust for brands. It obviously can create increased efficiency, right? So time spent doing this properly and more thoroughly up front is going to lead to greater efficiency that allows you to focus your energies elsewhere in the future. It means easier content maintenance, right? Managing and maintaining your website is kind of part of increased efficiency, but it's just less frustrating. Let's go with that at a bare minimum. And your website, you can update it more quickly, which means your content can be more relevant. It allows you to minimize mistakes. Look, mistakes can be really embarrassing and problematic. And moving to digital first as a content publishing strategy, you can think about PDFs, or if you printed a report that has an error in it, well, that can be really embarrassing, and if it's data, it could actually be a serious problem. But with a digital-first approach that's more flexible and more mindful of it, you can minimize mistakes, and ultimately, of course, this is all more cost-effective. So beyond making our content more valuable and effective in advancing our mission, flexible content design can make clearly a significant impact on your organization. And with that, I thank everyone who has been here for the full hour. We are here to continue to take questions, and again, we reach out to us, and we will answer on Twitter, and I'll hand it back to Sean and Tristan.
All right, we have a number of questions. If your name is Molly or Stacy or Kareem, we're going to get to your questions in just a second, so stick around. Molly asks, what are the most important analytics metrics that you use to evaluate engagement? In other words, how do you know engagement's happening?
That's a great question, and it's interesting because it has changed. I will say that engagement metrics are what we focus on heavily when we're doing upfront for a site redesign, and then to evaluate against. And if you're familiar with Google Analytics, they're really the big sort of straightforward ones. It's things like length of stay on site, obviously, number of pages visited, bounce rate, all of those things that indicate how many pages are people visiting, things like return users or return visits. You want, obviously, it would be ideal if you had less new users as a percentage. Not that you don't want more new users in total. It's that you want the percentage of return users to be higher overall. So you want bigger traffic, more repeat visits. That has always been sort of the holy grail or the basis of engagement when we look at how well are we doing. However, I will say that mobile has really changed that, and I'll say this in a way that might resonate for a lot of people who might get news through things like Facebook and even Twitter. And that is that, again, as content has become more fragmented, in fact, I, for example, use Facebook, yes, to connect with my friends, but I actually follow a lot of the news sources that I really like. And I go to, for example, Fox a bunch of times a day and only look at one page. So my bounce rate for that is 100% for them. But I am reading the content. I'm not doing additional pages. So the numbers can be skewed, and you do need to therefore parse out mobile visits versus desktop visits to try to at least account for the fact where people who are on mobile, who might be clicking through social media, they're just not going to poke around and visit a ton of pages. It's a little more tricky, but that's what you're looking for.
Kareem asks, how do we take advantage of social media without getting lost in it? Oh, man, that's a great question. We don't want to spend too much time on Twitter and Facebook, but we also want to maintain a consistent presence and keep track of our grantees in real time. Let me take a quick swing at the top of this, which is if you had to choose, Kareem, between Twitter and Facebook, and gentlemen, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe Facebook owns about 80% of the social marketplace now between Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp. Which is to say, if you're on Twitter, you ought to be really clear about why you're there. Lots of journalists are there, lots of influential folks, including the President of the United States. But overall, chances are most of the folks you want to talk to, most of the folks you want to keep track of, it's happening on Facebook or one of the Facebook properties. But gentlemen, how would you answer that question?
So I think that there are, in this day and age, a lot of tools that we can use to offload some of that kind of like, cognitive load that comes with it. So, if you're talking about posting to social networks, Buffer is one, which I use and have used before, and I can just like schedule when things go up to your different social channels. I know that MailChimp right now, they have a way to post content straight through to Instagram. That's part of your newsletter marketing strategy, whatever it may be. So I think that if you're in a position where you go on Twitter, like do something for business, and then 15 minutes later you look up and you realize, the sun is going down and you haven't done that thing, then maybe offload that responsibility to some other tools instead of making it a manual process.
And one other thing that I'll say, first of all, you can obviously post on one and have it show up in other places easily. But I think when it comes to offloading, with regard to what Sanango was saying, offloading that to your users, that's a perfect example of engagement and how you can make it more effective. We do a lot of work to make it so that these individual flexible content elements are more shareable, and we do some things like making it so that highlightable text, when you just highlight text in a page, can be shared by someone instantly. So creating calls to action that are part of the designed experience that elevate important takeaways and make them digestible chunks that your folks, your audience want to share is a critical part of getting greater social reach without getting lost in it yourself.
Right. I think one other thing I would just add is that it's obviously really critical that we're all really strategic in our work because you can get lost. And so at the end of the day, I hope that we're not in the business, most of us, of collecting numbers. I had this many impressions. I had this many likes. What you really want to ask yourself probably is, who are the 10 people who could change this issue for us, that whatever it might be that you're working on? And then figure out, do we know them? Are we talking to them? Do we know where they are? What watering holes on the social web they visit? Because it's going to be more likely, and you can ask people. They'll volunteer this information. They want to get valuable insights and information, but as we all do, they want it to come to them. They don't want to go looking for it. So some of this is going to be about also getting really clear, and it's probably about doing focus groups or doing some user research with the people you most want to reach and understand where they are, and then focus your attention and time there. A couple of other questions. I know we've gone over time. We'll have a full replay up, but for those of you who want to indulge us, I know the fellows are willing to stick around for a few. Stacy asks, have you ever tried any of the content or headline analyzing tools that supposedly measure emotional appeal or power words, and what do you think of them? So in other words, is it really important to use action words, and are there great tools out there that can take some of the content we're putting up and help us make it that much warmer or more emotionally resonant with people?
So there's, I guess, a technical answer to this, and there's also just a content strategy answer. The technical one is probably a tool that we use quite often called Yoast, and this is just like an SEO plugin type of thing for WordPress CMS. And what it allows you to do is then choose which way that you want the header, maybe the description, an image or so on, how it will show up in people's social media streams, in Google search results, and other kind of alternate views of your site that's not your site actually. And so one of the things that it allows you to do is choose what the keyword is going to be for the page. And it will go through all the content on the page to kind of analyze what's there and give you red light, yellow light, or green light. So if I'm on one of my pages and I choose, the focus word is going to be like design, it's going to give me a yellow or a red light because it's just so generic. But instead, maybe I'm going to go with something like, flexible digital content design. And that's a much more green-lighted word because it's very specific to the content I have. So you can use tools like that, which I think look at what you have already and then help you to a better solution, rather than the more snake oil types of approaches where you kind of have to choose cool action words.
And if I can also add to that again, I go back to this idea of, this doesn't quite answer the question because I'm not familiar actually with the tool that does that, what was mentioned here, and I think it's pretty cool, so we'll check it out. But when it comes to keywords, right, and the strategy of important keywords and relevancy and authenticity, right, coming up in search and things that people will pay attention to, again, I go back to this idea of brand strategy. When you do sort of interviews with stakeholders outside of an organization and perform that kind of research, you hear them, those interviews are the perfect opportunity when we're developing brand language platforms, actually, that resonate with authenticity using the vernacular that folks that are engaging an organization use, not sort of internal organizational jargon, right? And sometimes maybe jargon's appropriate depending on your audience, but that's a great way to get words that maybe not from an emotional appeal standpoint, but from a relevancy standpoint matter, and using those ideas during research of brand strategy. And you can do this during a website engagement too. You just interview folks. You then have a bank of words that you can then, as Sanango was suggesting, use to work into different types of content that is going to perform well in search, and then also weave it into that invisible content like your search titles and your search descriptions and such that show up in external sources.
I will add one more thing, which is, Stacy, we actually did a webinar on this very question. The good folks at The Atlantic magazine have done a lot of research on seeing how headlines travel across the social web. In order for people to engage with their content, the first thing they have to do is be intrigued by the headlines or the titles. And so they've done a lot of work on this. You can check out the webinar we did with them a little while back. It's on comnetwork.org. Let's get to a couple more questions, and then we're going to have to wrap this up. Casey asks, we've noticed that people engage less with what we call branded images that have photos with a quote or a logo over the top, even if they're beautifully designed. They engage more with candid photos. So if we look too branded, are we losing our authenticity?
Sanango thinking, so I'm just going to make note of one thing, which is that Deb Stetler, who's actually a client of ours, hi Deb, asked sort of a converse to this question, interestingly, right? Which is, KC is saying here that branded photos in his or her experience, they might get less attention, and with a logo or a quote on top, that's a little different than what Deb's saying. But there's sort of this idea of content that can be more differentiating, so it doesn't look generic like other folks in your space. So if you work in the climate space, for example, the same images, the same general approach seems to be pretty prevalent. But then you have this idea of if it's too branded, does it feel inauthentic or too much like advertising? And I think it's a delicate balance. Reading KC's comment, it may relate more to social, and we generally are an advocate of having branded images, even if it's just for raising visibility, brand awareness, right? So having a small slug line in the bottom of images that show up on Twitter and such, maybe it has a small quote on it. I can't say why those things. I would think they would get engaged with more heavily if they're designed well, but maybe not. To Deb's point, which is kind of related to this, I think this approach of treated images, right? If you have to use stock and you rely on things that might seem a bit generic because lots of people in your space are using it, if you don't have your own photo library, you do have to find ways to treat them and make them original. And that's what good brand photo design guidelines, or if you're just doing it for digital, a strategy and approach with templates that allows you to create those within a house style, if you will, is really important. Because ultimately, you may not get the level of engagement you want, and I think that just has to be tested through engagement sort of, social metrics, let's say. I think that brand awareness part is important, and that's valuable either way. Hopefully you can get both.
I'll just point out one example that's on Twitter and is immensely popular, and it's this account called We Rate Dogs. It's the dumbest thing in the world, but it's just pictures of dogs, and then they write a little bit of text, and they always give the dogs like more than 100%. So it's always like 11 out of 14, Bobby is a good dog. 11 out of 12, good pupper. And it's just a picture of a dog, but the context then is that dogs are perfect and pure and good, and they always get great ratings. And so by using a generic picture, it could even be a stock photo, but then you add like what you want the social engagement to be, you can raise it so you're not relying 100% on the photo to do all the work for you. So I know it's a dumb example, but it's a great account, and it's obviously got a lot of traction online because they use photo and then these great captions.
If you guys want a really fantastic example of using imagery to really deliver clarity on who it is, who you are, and what you do, I would recommend everybody go check out the Wilberforce Foundation. I defy you to land on their page and not know exactly what they do within 1.5 seconds, as long as you're wearing your glasses or have good vision. Couple more questions, then we're gonna jump. What is the best way to integrate video into our digital content strategy? To give you a flip answer, it's to do it. It's really critical. Video is so much stickier than anything else right now. But gentlemen, what are your thoughts on video? How do you bring it into the strategy going forward? Because obviously, it's flip to say just do it, but there is a lot of work required to do video and do it well.
Yeah, and I think there is a lot required. If you don't have a team to support the creation and maintenance of video, then it might not be a good strategy. Assuming that you do, then I think going back to what we've been saying for this past hour, finding ways to make it much more flexible. So Al Jazeera Plus, they do really, really great kind of short videos online that are all captioned because a lot of people will watch their news feeds without audio on. And so you can get like 1 or 2 little snippets. News Now does the same thing, and many other organizations. So in that way, they're kind of like packaging their video content for that particular audience. And then, of course, you go onto their site and you can watch the longer versions of the newscast or the broadcast. So I think if your strategy is to, let's say, build your following online and get people interested in your issue, then using those shorter snippets is a pretty good strategic move. If your strategy is to have people on your site for a long time and like read and view your stories and engage with what's happening with your funder model, whatever it may be, then those longer videos kind of placed prominently on a story page are probably going to do more of that heavy lift.
Yeah, if I can add to that, I think as Sanango is saying, first of all, on these high-value pages, even if you don't have the wherewithal and capacity to do a lot of video work because it can be a heavy lift, and I think there's a decision to be made by any organization about how high-polished that work is ultimately, because it doesn't necessarily need to be like, super high production value, but either way, even if you only have the ability to make a few of them, doing a couple of good segments that, again, when we get back to this idea of explaining something as complicated as a theory of change in a way that's engaging to an audience that doesn't live and breathe ideas of theories of change and strategic operating models, well, putting those things atop those pages and allowing people to get that view and sort of digest it, and within 3 or so minutes really get a good feeling, you get a lot of value out of that, and then you might be able to repurpose some of that. Also, I want to add to Sanango's point about Al Jazeera Plus, which is, you know, an organization that we think is doing a really great job. If you are going to use video, have the design, the supporting design elements of how that work is produced be integrated into your brand standards. So when we're developing brand standards and the visual design systems for organizations that work sort of in any medium, if you're doing something in video, having that slug with your brand, this little animated sequence, knowing what typeface related to your brand and what the placement of those captions so that when people are seeing them not in with audio, what is the right approach that visually communicates your brand and is consistent? Make sure you think about that so it is strategic and not just creating video content and then putting it up.
All right, next question comes from Paola. But before I do that, I want to give a quick shout out to my fellow super nerds at World Wildlife Fund. They just sent in a picture. There's about a dozen people in a conference room listening to us right now. Hope you guys are having fun. It looks like they're eating, which is good. Wish you brought some over to us. Paola asks, how important is it to present the same information in several formats? So if you're telling a story, do you need to produce a video, an article, a written piece, several Facebook posts? How much can we dissect the information and make it bite-sized and appropriate for these different platforms?
So I would actually push back a little bit on this and ask if it actually is the same information, mostly because of the attention spans that we're talking about and the purpose, the reason that people might be in a certain place looking at it. So, we can atomize this as much as possible. We have our headers, subheaders, keywords, images, and so on. But we don't always have to put all of that together all the time in all of those different places. So something as simple as a header and an image will do the trick when we're looking at our social feeds. Something much more complicated that includes a header, a description, an image, a caption, maybe a blurb is going to be much more effective in the newsletter. So in that way, I think kind of questioning if it is actually the same content, and if it's not, then what are the pieces of almost like that atomized content, the sub-pieces, if you will, that we need to put together in the places that matter. So you want to be able to tell what that story is, and you want to make sure that people are engaging with it, and that you're presenting whatever the core message is. But definitely ask yourself if by dissecting you let the platforms that you're on or the people that are viewing take more of that responsibility for figuring out what that is.
Yeah, the whole benefit of designing sort of content through these flexible models is that it doesn't have to be the same information in different formats, as Sanango said. When it's appropriate, it can be, but it also can be broken up and repackaged and remixed in a way that allows you to use it more flexibly, right? And that's important to think about.
Let me just offer a bold idea. You don't have to do it all. It's rare that there are nonprofits. It's rare. Most of us are working with very, very limited resources, and because of that, we have to make tough choices. And so I think it's critical that you ought to have in your quiver the ability to do a whole suite of different things. You ought to be able to do a dozen or more things, to have capacity to know how to do those things. But then the real challenge is saying to yourself, what are the 2 or 3 things I can do really, really well and that I'm confident are going to land in front of the people that I need to engage with and move, and will give them what they need to take the next act that I want them to take, right? That they're going to become more aware, that they're going to become more activated, that they're going to take some sort of action, whatever it is that you're trying to achieve. Deborah has a final question, and this is where we're going to wrap it up. Do you have any suggestions for differentiating our brand through images in our content? She said, I see the same set of stock images being used by many of the organizations in our field, which is clean energy policy. So let me take a guess. A lot of solar panels, a few windmills, and, oh goodness, what else passes for sort of cliched clean energy pictures? Maybe a Tesla or two? Gentlemen, any thoughts there on how to break out of the tyranny of obnoxious clean energy images?
So I think the idea of using stock photos, there are a lot of organizations that maybe, they can't pay for photo shoots for all of these different topics, and that's totally okay. So some of those are naturally going to creep in. It's just kind of the nature of content these days is that we need to work with kind of, what's available and priced out for our organization and so on. But I think that there are some things that we can do to either treat the imagery or to contextualize it in a way that makes it special. So, branding the images is one very, very simple way to go about it. Like we were talking about before, maybe that decreases engagement because people feel like it's a marketing ploy. But that's a very simple way to make sure that, that picture of a windmill is our windmill. Another one is to maybe you don't need images in the first place. Like maybe it's something else. Or using videos, another thing that we talked about, which there's more cost associated with that, but of course it does pull you away from those basic stock photos. So I think that there are certain things that can be done. Of course, it depends on what your brand wants to be online and where these images and kind of these stock photos are showing up. The last thing that I would say is that especially when it comes to clean energy, perhaps we have been too focused on the pieces of technology, and maybe we can start to ask questions about how this actually affects us. The air conditioners that we use, they blow air in our faces and not just kind of into empty rooms. And so maybe that's a specific way to start differentiating is to focus on the human aspect. And then it becomes very different from others or other people in that space.
Yeah, if I can sort of add to that one small bit is that this goes back to this idea of context and perspective and thinking about the content that way. I think it's a great point that Sanango makes about thinking more broadly about what that narrative is, and that can perhaps find a different vantage point to enter that sort of issue. But then also, I think being really selective about that content, about your stock photography is really important. I will say I have spent more hours in my life than I care to recount going through endless scrolls, and I'll tell you, you get kind of good at it. You immediately know when an image just scrolling quickly through a stock house looks good and might be not generic and has something to it. So being really selective and not settling is important, and then finding other sources. And we've started to try and find other sources, certainly than iStock and others. And there are some good ones out there, like Unsplash is one that we use quite a bit that offers some good photos that, yes, it's going to be topically the same stuff, but it is going to be different photography and hopefully higher quality. I think quality is the most important part. There's so much dreck out there in the stock photography landscape. We actually, as part of photography guidelines that we'll create for organizations when we're doing brand guidelines, et cetera, we've done things like how to look for stock photography and do's and don'ts, because it's hard to know if you're not an expert in this stuff and aren't a designer, let's say, what that nuanced difference is between an image of like the same group of people that feels canned versus feels kind of authentic, and understanding what to look out for and what to avoid, and just have that clear so when you're looking on your own, you know that is important.
Yeah, I would just add, as someone who spent some time in the policy space, that some of the research that I was privy to is that people just don't identify personally with windmills or with solar panels. You don't hug those. You don't have a relationship with those. And so I think one of the things you have to think about is really where are the outcomes that you're focused on. Unless you're literally writing a very technical piece of policy about new emerging technology in solar panels, chances are there's a better image to use than a picture of a solar panel. When people think about clean energy, what they're really, I think their hopes and aspirations tend to arrive around places involving their personal health or the health of their children, or, people are just, and obviously there's a tremendous number of bad stock images of people. Just go on, name your photo site. But I think trying to get past the idea of illustrating, car companies, when they're selling you a car, they show you a picture of a car, but they spend an awful lot of time showing you someone with a shit-eating grin on their face having a great time in that car. And the reason is because you identify with the person, not with what's under the hood. And with that, guys, I think we have to leave it here. Any closing thoughts, gentlemen, before we go? We've taken 90 minutes of your time. Very gracious of you to do so.
Thank you all very much.
Yeah, closing thought is thank you, everyone. To the folks who had to move on, thank you. And to the 78 of you I see who are still here, and maybe more for people who are in a room with a couple of people, thank you for taking time out of your day, listening to what we have to say and offer. I hope it's been helpful. And, we'll see you online, and we will definitely see you at ComNet in Miami if you're attending.
Yeah, just a couple quick notes. So there'll be a survey that's going to pop up in about 35 seconds. It has like 2 or 3 questions. It won't take more than a minute of your time, but it makes a huge difference in ensuring that we're getting you guys the information that you want and need. So please do take that. Final thoughts. Comment 17, the gentleman just referenced, will be in Miami. They'll be in Miami. But if you haven't signed up, you won't be, because I'm afraid we are sold out, but you can add your name to the wait list. Every year we're able to sneak a few folks in off the wait list. So add your name there. You can get to that at comnet17.org. Thanks again. Huge note of thanks to Matt and Sanongo. These guys, as you probably have learned over the past hour plus, are real experts, really thoughtful, good people, and we're so grateful for them generously donating their time and their good thinking to all of us. So thanks a lot, everybody. We'll see you again very soon.